And just a little flow for how we're going to do this. So we're going to do the presentation, and then at the end we'll cut the recording and we'll have time for some questions, some Q&A, with our friends here from EOHLC. So if you want to kind of save your question for later, you can just drop it in the chat, and I will try to moderate that as we get to the end. If it's a really like you cannot go on, it's a burning question, it's like a clarifying question, and we can interrupt and ask our presenters to clarify before we move on. But otherwise, we'll hold everything to the end, so you can just put it in the chat if you want to save it for later, and I'll keep that on, and then we can either ask them or unmute. Although this crew is a little bit bigger than we thought today, so maybe we'll try to moderate that. So again, thank you so much, Melanie and Andy, for joining us from EOHLC today. And I will kick it over to you to say a little bit more about yourselves and about CHAMP and get us right into it.
Well, since I appear at the top of the screen, he'll start. I'm Melanie Loveland-Hale, and as Greta said, I'm the Senior Housing Management Specialist at EOHLC. And so I work with that title. I work most closely with the CHAMP system and housing authorities and the interpretation of the regulations, the tenant selection regulations, and also work directly with the Centralized Screening Office, which is ASG. That is the agency that oversees the review of the priorities. And welcome to you all. Glad to be here. Andy?
Thank you, Melanie. Yes, hi, my name is Andy Clinton. I'm the CHAMP project manager, also a data policy and systems analyst here at UHLC. And so I, along with Melanie, Bill, and a few other folks here at the agency, work on developing the application, making sure the application is compliant with regulations. So we spend a lot of time, with our developers and, computer software programs. So thank you for having us, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. And I will add, sorry, William Halfpenny is here too, attorney in the Office of General Counsel at EOHLC, who will be joining us more for the Q&A. But I will turn it over to you all. I'm going to take myself off spotlight. And if you want to go ahead and share your screen if you're able. And if not, I will make sure that that's possible.
Okay, so that would be me. Pardon me with my tech illiteracy while I find share your screen on this app. Share screen. Okay, good, excellent. Okay, is everyone hopefully, let's see.
Yes, that looks great.
All right, we're seeing slides?
Yes, you're great.
Excellent, excellent. Okay. And Andy, I'm gonna let you start the slide.
All right, great. Thank you, Melanie. And as Melanie said, thank you folks for being here. Today we're going to talk about CHAMP, which stands for the Common Housing Application for Massachusetts Programs. I assume maybe because the attendance was higher than expected that most of these folks here have heard about CHAMP, are familiar with CHAMP, maybe have helped someone with the CHAMP process. So today we're going to cover just the basics. We're going to start a little bit with, just the basic information about CHAMP. We're going to talk about the history of CHAMP and the history of the regulations that underlie CHAMP. And we'll go through a little bit of the specifics. But I think, Melanie, you can bring us to the next slide.
Okay. Oh dear, it's not advancing. Oh, there we go. Excellent.
There we go. One back.
Oh, thank you.
There we go. Perfect. So this, I like to start all the presentations I do on CHAMP with this slide, just to let people know exactly how you can access CHAMP. So this is the website here, www.mass.gov/CHAMP. Any applicant who's in the continental United States can access this website and apply online. If you need to use paper, CHAMP also has a paper application. We maintain a paper application process. So you'll be able to download that paper application from the link here. And this can be printed and mailed to any housing authority or regional administering agency across the state as well. So that's just a little bit of basic information on how to apply. I think we're good, Melanie.
I know, I apologize. I'm having difficulty advancing. Do you have a thought on why that might be? Here we go. Okay,
There we
scroll
go.
is required apparently. Okay, thank you.
Perfect. So this is the policy history and CHAMP milestones for CHAMP, as well as just the 10 selection regulations that have kind of existed that undergird CHAMP as a system. So our current homeless priority regs were instituted in 1986, all the way back in 1986. So although there have been a lot of systematic changes, the underlying policies have actually stayed pretty consistent since that time. Between 1986 and obviously the launch of CHAMP in 2019, tenant selection was actually done, and still is done for eligibility and qualifications by each individual housing authority. So this meant that EOHLC had limited oversight and that applicants had to apply individually at each housing authority. So between 2014 and 2018, as a result of the reform legislation that was passed in 2014, EOHLC began developing CHAMP, and that was a long process. We started off small and realized pretty quickly that the system was going to be pretty expansive. Um, During that time, we worked on working with housing authorities, working with applicant groups, working with other stakeholders to make sure that the system was developed appropriately. And in 2019, we launched CHAMP Live for applicants for state-aided public housing. The next few years saw us mostly in response to the pandemic, as most folks were. But additionally, we were also quietly adding additional programs into CHAMP, including AHVP in 2020, and then MRVP, you'll see later on down the timeline, came with the launch of centralized priority screening. So we're going to talk a lot about that today. Melanie's going to walk us through a lot of the various priorities. We're going to walk through a lot of the various priorities together. And we're going to talk about the process that ASG, also known as the Centralized Screening Office, utilizes to make homeless priority determinations. And then we obviously just have overarching CHAMP goals here. So we're striving to improve access to public housing, MRVP, and AHVP housing resources, aiming for fairness, transparency, and accountability. So because it's now a centralized system, we're able to see all of the activity that occurs in the tenant selection process, and we're also able to ensure that there's fairness and transparency. We've also improved and simplified the application process for applicants, which was a major goal for CHAMP and is the primary kind of guiding ethos of the system. We've also made it, and this includes making it easier to keep the application current.
Yeah, now.
Including the applicant's address, household info, and phone numbers, which are very important. It also reduces duplicate data entry and duplicate application processes, and made things a little more efficient for housing authorities as well. So those were the goals that we were striving for and continue to strive for. And here I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the background of centralized screening and the centralized screening office. So in 2019, when we launched, as the timeline slide kind of suggested, all housing authorities and all RAAs were doing their own priority reviews and priority screening themselves, basically. So in this case, there was no centralized office. There wasn't, we weren't really overseeing too strictly how the priority verifications were occurring, other than through the appeals process, which is in the regulation. But we weren't mandating any sort of decisions one way or another, and the housing authorities had a lot of discretion. So when CHAMP launched, because of how the lists were organized, this created kind of a little bit of an inefficiency for housing authorities and applicants. So much so that it really kind of made the CHAMP process untenable administratively in the long run. So as a result, we reviewed our priorities, spoke internally, spoke with external stakeholders, and developed the plan for the centralized screening office. So this is basically one, just like it sounds, one centralized place that will screen all priority um, all priorities and preferences in order to, for all priority applicants, 1 through 4, in order to make sure that they're verified and that when a housing authority goes to fill a vacancy, the list pool that they're working with is in verified rank order. So, this has a lot of benefits. One, that LHAs have fully verified priority wait lists and only screen for eligibility and qualifications. So that cuts their timing by a substantial portion, cuts the amount of work that they have to do. But it also allows the applicant to deal with one entity instead of potentially having to deal with hundreds of different organizations, that might have varying requirements for what they need to submit, et cetera. The centralized screening office is currently staffed by a vendor called Archipelago Strategies Group, also known as ASG, and they operate the CSO from their office in Lawrence. The goals of centralized screening, pretty clear. It's to reduce the cost and effort for tenant selection across the system and across the state. But it's also to make sure that we're filling the units and providing the allocation of housing resources and vouchers more efficiently. It also allows us to ensure consistency in the application of tenant selection regulations to priority verifications. And it allows us to improve customer service for applicants and appropriately prioritize emergency applicants under our regulations. So this is a pretty big sea shift for us. In terms of just how the state operates, and also in terms of how involved EOHLC is with the tenant selection process. We've had a lot of feedback about this since the launch, obviously in 2023, and obviously at first it was kind of an operational hurdle to kind of get the backlog of folks screened and go through each of the applicants. But as we stand today, currently in what we call a steady state flow with the incoming and verifying of priorities, I'm happy to report that most of the feedback that we get about the process is from the housing authority end is positive. If you have a particular experience working with ASG at the centralized screening office, feel free to put it in the chat and we can maybe talk about it later in our Q&A. So with that said, who is ASG? So as I said before, they operate the centralized screening office. And so what do? Basically, they're contacting all priority applicants who apply through the CHAMP system. They're pulling weekly batches for review of those applicants. They're sending requests for documentation. They're reviewing documentation. And they're also basically staffing a call center that's available from, available during the week for applicants to call and basically ask questions about the status of their application, of their priority verification, I should say. They also have walk-in hours available Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 4:30. And they also have dedicated phone lines and email addresses for applicants with questions about their priority status. So you can see that info there on the screen, and we'll make sure you folks get that. Sorry, thanks, Melanie. Melanie's ready to go because this is her next part coming up. So, but thank you. We'll be back. I'll be back for a later portion of the presentation, but I'd like to turn it over to Melanie to kind of kick us off talking about the good stuff, the priority regulations.
Thank you. We are a smooth operation, aren't we? Maybe if we do a dozen more of these, this will just go like clockwork. Thank you for your patience. All right, so Andy walked you through the CHAMP process generally. Every CHAMP applicant is prompted when they apply to describe their housing situation. If an applicant is homeless or at risk of homelessness, they'll be asked to verify the reason for their homelessness. And that's where this document can be helpful. There are 4 homeless priorities. Priority 1, displaced by natural forces. That's fire, flood, earthquake, natural disaster. Priority 2, displaced by public action, urban renewal, think eminent domain, or in some cases, a 121B low rent housing project or other public improvement. Priority 3, displaced by public action, but this is referring to state sanitary code violations, for example, or building code or local ordinances. And priority 4, which is homeless for reasons in the housing situation priority policy. And this includes 3 categories of homelessness, but they each qualify as priority 4. There's no distinction in terms of hierarchy among these. This includes P4A, priority 4A, which is court-ordered eviction, priority 4B, severe medical emergency, and priority 4C, abusive situation. If an applicant selects one of these homeless categories, the applicant's required to verify their homeless claim. And as Andy noted, ASG reviews these claims. ASG grants or denies the priority claim based on the verification documents that are submitted by the applicant. What you see here is a quick reference to the various priority claims and the kind of verification that's required. You should keep this as a reference, and it's available to applicants directly in CHAMP as a link. And before the end of the presentation, I will add it to the chat so that you can find that document as well. It's a link that leads to a public housing notice that has 2 documents that are referenced. This is organized, this short checklist is organized to show the verifications that are required for all the priority claims and verification that's specific to a particular kind of claim. You'll notice that some of the sections are labeled not required, and this is because there are some priority claims that one submitted document will verify several different requirements, for example, or the verification is not required due to the nature of the particular claim. One thing to note, we are adding a feature in CHAMP that will limit the selection of priority claims to 2. 4A, B, and C are each counted as 1 claim. This will help focus reviews, we hope, to the central reason for an applicant's homelessness, and certainly lessen applicant confusion and the number of documents that they might be required to submit. It has, frequently in the past, we have experienced applicants who, as evidence, is logical evidence of their urgency and distress at their housing situation, will select all of the priority categories. And, it certainly, what that then requires is that they have to then be responsive with a number of documents that might be completely unrelated to their housing situation. And we're hoping that this will help applicants in this process. I'm going to go through each priority briefly to see what's required for verification and what documents would not properly verify the claim. First, the applicants should understand that there are some verifications that are required of all applicants, regardless of what priority that you're claiming. And that's starting with proof of primary residence. A primary residence is the home where the applicant is currently living or was living at the time of their displacement, provided the applicant lived or intended to live at the address for at least 9 months of the year. This definition is relevant and this criteria is relevant because homeless priorities are based upon the reason you are being displaced from your last or current primary housing. This does not mean displacement from temporary housing. So for example, my landlord tells me I have to leave and I agree I'm going to leave the apartment that I have been leasing and I move out. I then move in with a relative, for example, temporarily until I can find a new apartment. And unfortunately, I am a very unlucky person and there's a fire in this my relative's apartment and I'm forced to move again. I can't qualify for a homeless priority 1 displaced by natural forces, in this case fire, because this was my temporary residence where the fire occurred. I had already left my primary residence in my example willingly, even though my landlord asked me to leave, not quite so willingly, but I did leave without being evicted. Also note that the definition of primary residence doesn't mean that the applicant has to have lived in the residence for a total of 9 months. For example, I could sign a lease on a Monday and fire damages the apartment 2 days later. Let's hope not, but if that occurred, the unit would still qualify as my primary residence because I have leased that apartment and with the intention of staying there as my primary residence. Verification of primary residence could include, and this is not a complete list, a lease, a letter from a landlord identifying me as the leaseholder, utility bills, copy of rent checks, for example, or proof of a child's enrollment in school and confirmation of the address. ASG can definitely request additional documents if the documents that are submitted don't sufficiently verify the primary residence. Next, every applicant must provide proof of temporary living situation. Of course, this only applies if they've already been displaced, obviously. This can include a letter from a shelter with detailed information regarding the applicant's current living situation, a letter from a family or friend with those details, a letter from a community figure such as police or church. And you might be wondering why applicants have to provide proof of current temporary living situation. And the reason is, as I noted earlier, homeless priorities are granted based upon the displacement from your primary residence. So for example, if you become homeless in January, apply in CHAMP and you're granted priority 1, for example. And before you get screened by a housing authority for a unit, you're able to sign a new lease in March, in my example. You would no longer qualify for the granted priority, and losing the granted priority would change your place on a housing authority's waiting list. So this is a criteria that is reviewed. Finally, every applicant must complete a section of the CHAMP application on page 5, which prompts the applicant for more details of their housing situation. And that's required to support the applicant's claim. Those were the verifications required by all applicants. Now let's look at each priority separately. And Andy, I'm going to turn this one over to you.
Great. Thank you, Melanie. So Melanie kind of just gave us an overview of what every priority applicant needs to be able to attest to and prove. I'm going to take you through priorities 1, 2, and 3 fairly quickly because they're, I would say, the rarest, thankfully, of the priorities that we typically see, and also the most, I don't want to say black and white, but basically the idea is black and white, right? They're the most clear cut in terms of you can have this information, and there's really a kind of a discrete set of documents that you can use to provide that verification. So the first is displaced by natural forces. Also, this includes fire or natural disaster of some kind, flood as well. So in this situation, the acceptable pieces of documentation for proof of displacement would be, for fire, an official fire report. This report should include your primary residence, should indicate that the unit is uninhabitable. It should also provide, sufficient proof that the applicant has not caused or substantially contributed to the situation, right? That's important for the no fault aspect of the homeless definition. Alternatively, you can provide a letter of the Board of Health or a similar type of local agency, such as or nonprofit like the Red Cross, that will provide a condemnation letter with the primary address for the applicant, indicating also that the unit is uninhabitable. For this one, ASG will be fairly proactive. We've had situations where they have reached out to the local fire department to get the more complete fire report, things like that. They'll be very proactive, but certain pieces of documentation would not be enough to prove this priority. That includes police reports, incomplete fire reports that don't itemize one of the pieces of information from the left-hand column, letters from neighbors, friends, family that attest that the fire occurred and that the person's displaced. And then news clippings that don't show that the primary residence is uninhabitable, or say that the person lived there. So those types of kind of more informal pieces of documentation would not be sufficient. But fortunately, in Massachusetts, if there is a fire that's caused the displacement, typically there is some sort of fire report or Board of Health letter from those agencies. So we typically have ASG work, if they can, with those local agencies as well, to get that documentation. The second piece, oops, sorry, only one
sorry.
last part. I just want to mention for natural disaster, we can also accept things like federal disaster declarations or official reports from the Red Cross or FEMA as well. So that's just a little bit of the difference there. Great. Priority 2, this is displaced by public action, with parentheses, urban renewal. You can think of this as eminent domain in the modern day, right? It's when the government, for one reason or another, determines that, we need to take the property that you live in for some sort of governmental project, and as a result, you're displaced. So the types of acceptable documentation for proof of displacement for this priority include copies of the official notification of land or property taking and the reasons stated from the public agency involved, notice of displacement due to a low-rent housing project. These are things that are itemized in the regulation, and actually this priority comes from the statute itself. So a lot of this stuff, you'll see references that statute. But this is for, any time that the government's taking a property by eminent domain. And that will typically come with a variety of official documents from that agency. Unacceptable documentations or pieces of documentation would include just an applicant statement. That's not sufficient. Statements from the friends or family, also additionally not sufficient. Document from a private entity, such as the person purchasing a building or the landlord saying that the government's taking something. So those things wouldn't be acceptable unless, of course, it was coming from the official agencies. One note here is that for tenants who live in public housing, if they get displaced by a redevelopment project, they are also eligible to claim this type of priority. Great. And priority 3, this is displaced by public action as it relates to the sanitary code. So you can think of this as condemnation. And basically, that's what, obviously, when the unit that you're living in is condemned for some reason. Perhaps it wasn't a legal unit to begin with, and the landlord was renting you an illegal unit, so it got condemned, or perhaps there was some sort of other damage to the unit that you didn't cause. That would also be a reason to receive this priority and for there to be a condemnation. Basically, this would also need to be verified by official documentation. Pictures alone, pictures of mold or of damage to the property, would it by itself not suffice to demonstrate proof for this priority? Inspection reports alone wouldn't even do that. We would need to see an official order of displacement, and that must be due to minimum standards of fitness for human habitation established by the sanitary code, the building code, or other similar local ordinances or zoning rules. This letter must also include the date of displacement or future displacement. And the order cannot indicate that the applicant or any of the household members had caused or substantially contributed to the condemnation. So essentially, someone couldn't, not care for a property, become, so uninhabitable that it gets condemned, and then apply for this priority. We would also need a written statement of the applicant's efforts to remedy the situation causing the displacement. So some of these examples would be alerting the landlord of the issue, notifying the Board of Health, court records that demonstrate this. Um, this priority and priorities 1, 2, and 3 are exceedingly rare. I can tell you in the system. Very few people claim these priorities because these situations are pretty narrow and pretty specific. And luckily in Massachusetts, they don't happen that often, um, based upon the data that we have from CHAMP. So I'll turn it back to Melanie to kind of take us through the homeless priorities, which are very common, and we do see a lot of those. So thank you, Melanie.
All right, thank you, Andy. The next few slides are going to focus on priority 4, and there are 3 categories of homelessness that each qualify as priority 4, starting with priority 4A, court-ordered eviction. Verification of this priority claim is right there in the title. It's the applicant having to provide an official eviction order or housing court, district court, or Boston Municipal Court judgment, or another court document requiring the tenant to vacate, such as an agreement between the applicant and the landlord in an eviction proceeding. It could include, but this is not an exhaustive list, an agreement for judgment or an agreement of the parties. In order to verify the priority, the court-ordered eviction must not indicate the reason for the eviction is the applicant's fault. So if there is a monetary judgment that is included in the order of eviction, the judgment, it would not qualify, that verification would not qualify to verify the priority 4A claim. Documents that don't serve to verify the priority also include a notice to quit, a summary process summons and complaint, a judgment that indicates, as I said, that the applicant was found at fault for arrears or damages, handwritten letter from a landlord, or an agreement between a landlord and tenant that is not approved by a court. And as Andy, I don't know if you noted earlier, Andy, but the largest number of CHAMP applicants do claim priority 4A. The next priority 4 category is severe medical emergency. This is a circumstance in which an applicant or a member of their household suffers from an illness or injury that poses a severe and medically documented threat to life or safety. And second, that the applicant's primary residence is or was a cause of the illness or injury, or is a substantial impediment to treatment or recovery. The applicant has to provide a form called the verification of severe medical emergency. It's got to be completed and signed by a medical provider, and that does not mean only just a physician. To verify the claim, the provider has to answer yes to question 1 and 1 other condition, and we'll look at the form in a moment. Verification that would not qualify includes a physician-generated form or a letter from a primary care doctor without the accompanying severe medical emergency form. Medical records, we certainly do not want to be receiving those, though ASG has unfortunately been provided those by applicants. Those are not required. An appointment documentation of medical appointments, for example, that does not qualify as verification, or general disability, unless the condition is impacted by the primary housing. So for example, someone who has a condition that causes them to have an inability to climb stairs, that would be a relevant condition. The applicant has to verify that the medical emergency is related to the applicant's primary housing. If the submitted documentation or the description of the current housing situation in the CHAMP application doesn't confirm this information, ASG will request additional information from the applicant. ASG might contact the medical professional to confirm the signature and that the medical provider did actually complete the form, but they would not inquire about the nature of the medical condition. We have had instances, unfortunately, where the applicant has signed the form themselves and that's been actually verified. This is the actual verification form here, and you'll have to squint really hard. My apologies at the size of this, but we don't need to go through the details of it. The form requires that the medical professionals certify first that the applicant is actually suffering from an illness or injury that poses a severe and medically documented threat to life and safety. And they indicate that by a checkbox. They are not writing a description of that. And second, that the primary residence is a significant contributing factor to their illness or injury, or the primary residence makes the treatment or recovery substantially harder. This form, it can be confusing, although it is a short form, it is confusing the way it is drafted in some way, because it's formatted in a way that would prompt replies that are specific to an applicant who is currently in their primary residence, and also to an applicant who is already displaced from their primary residence. This next slide describes a category well known to you all, of course, a category of priority 4C, abusive situation. This is a situation in which the applicant or a member of the household has suffered abuse as defined in the Abuse Prevention Act 209A. And as a result of the abuse, the applicant has been displaced or is about to be displaced from their primary residence. So again, that tie into the primary residence. Or they are currently experiencing a significant, immediate, and direct threat to life and safety associated with their primary residence. The Abuse Prevention Act defines abuse as the occurrence of one or more of the following acts between family or household members: attempting to cause or causing physical harm, placing another in fear or imminent serious physical harm, or causing another to engage involuntarily in sexual relations by force, threat, or duress, or coercive control. It's important to note, as you see here, applicants who are victims of sexual assault or stalking also may qualify for priority 4C. For these applicants, an abusive situation may include victims of sexual assault or stalking perpetrated by an individual who does not qualify as a family or household member. By design, there is great flexibility regarding what verification is required for priority 4C. This slide describes some of those verifications. And again, I want to emphasize this is not a complete list. The list is much more expansive, and ASG is reviewing each case individually. They are working with each applicant and providing a flexibility and guidance to that applicant in order to address their particular circumstances. But let's look at this a little more closely. So the documentation for proof of displacement, there's two parts to that. There's the actual documentation of displacement, and that would include the applicant description of their circumstances on the CHAMP application, and a detailed explanation from the applicant or another reliable source as designated by the applicant of the circumstances that led to the displacement. Second would be the documentation of the abusive situation. So the applicant needs to provide at least one form of documentation. And again, it doesn't have to be a particular piece of documentation. There is not ASG does not and cannot say, we will not approve this unless you provide us this exact document. But some of the various options could be a medical, police, or court report describing the abusive situation or confirming it, civil or criminal complaints, a letter from an attorney, a counselor, a psychological report, social service agency, any verifiable documentation that would support the existence of the abusive situation, family member witness statements, a third party written explanation of the circumstances, or a detailed explanation of the circumstances from the applicant. And really, what is unacceptable? I can only be very vague in this in saying that what is not acceptable is documentation that does not demonstrate that there was a displacement from a primary residence and that there was an abusive situation that related to that primary residence. So emphasizing that ASG addresses each applicant situation individually within the broad confines of the priority itself. In these next few slides, what you're seeing is just another valuable resource and a reference guide that you can use when you're assisting applicants. This is the expanded version of the one-page checklist that I showed you in an earlier slide. And this is also available on the link that I will add to the chat. This is a 32-page document. So what it does is it goes through each of the priorities and preferences that are involved in the tenant selection process. And it describes each of the kinds of verifications that are required that are specific to those priorities. I'm just going to show you this particular one. I've only grabbed it just to illustrate. In this case, it's priority 3, displaced by public action, sanitary code violations. But what you will see in this guide, as it's illustrated here, you will see that it's proof of displacement, proof of primary residence, proof of temporary living situation. Again, those are those core pieces that every applicant has to be able to provide. In this case, when we're talking about priority 3, there are 2 additional relevant documentations. There's the proof that the applicant has not caused or substantially contributed to the situation. So if we're talking about a health code violations and condemnation of the property as a result of that. So for example, if the description and the condemnation actually describes conditions that were caused by the applicant themselves, then that would be, they would not be able to sufficiently demonstrate this proof that they have not caused or contributed, so they would not get the priority. So that's what this particular criteria is relating to. And then this last piece, the proof the applicant has pursued ways to prevent or avoid the safety threatening situation. This particular criteria is unique to priority 3. And what it is looking for there, it's a very narrow application, and it really relates to those circumstances where an applicant, there's Board of Health involvement. And what the ASU would be looking for is that there had been communication between the applicant and the landlord in order to alert them to conditions that needed to be corrected, and some effort to have those conditions addressed before it rose to the level of having the building condemned. For example, if a faucet was left running or it had been leaking for the last 6 months, the landlord was never notified. The condition was allowed to continue, and it ultimately led to having the whole unit condemned. That might be a circumstance that would run afoul of this particular criteria, but this only applies to this priority 3 category. So Andy, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about appeals of priority determinations.
Thank you, Melanie.
You're welcome.
So Melanie just walked us through kind of how ASG makes their determinations and what information they base this on. What happens when an applicant gets a determination from ASG that, they're not happy with? Well, in the regulations, there's a provision for appeals of priority determinations that applicants can avail themselves of. The critical thing about this appeals process is that the applicant must do it or must request an appeal in writing within 20 days of the receipt of their determination letter for the denial of the priority. So that's a really important kind of deadline that's outlined in the appeals process that applicants should really pay attention to if they're making an appeal. But let's say they do. Let's walk through the process. So the first step is obviously applicant receives a determination they do not agree with. Then the next step would be for that applicant to send a written request for a private conference to the centralized screening office. And this can be done by mail or email, right? So email counts as in writing. And importantly, that has to be done within 20 days. After that, the centralized screening office will work with the applicant to schedule a private conference as either an in-person or an online meeting. Primarily, most of the appeals occur online. We have found, ASG has found that this is just more convenient for applicants. However, if an applicant prefers an in-person meeting, then ASG will work with them to schedule an in-person meeting at one of several regional locations across the state. The fourth step is the applicant appears at the private conference. That's important. Have to make sure we attend the private conference. That happens actually pretty more regularly than you would expect. That people request a private conference. There's one scheduled, but then they don't appear. So that's a critical step. Importantly, the person can be represented by a lawyer or someone else. And at this private conference, the applicant can provide new information or documents in support of their claim. This is an informal conference. You're trying to see if you can work it out with ASG. And I will say many times the decision is overturned because the applicant has brought in documentation that ends up verifying their information. So, in many cases, it could just be, and actually in most cases, in fact, priorities are denied for lack of documentation. If an applicant were to bring that documentation in, then they would reevaluate that. And it happens actually pretty frequently. The fifth step would be after the hearing, the centralized screening office appeals officer, who is different than the person who made the determination, will then evaluate the decision and any new information the applicant may have provided. And then the centralized screening office will issue their decision in writing. Basically, at that point, if the applicant still disagrees with the private conference decision, they can either request a reconsideration or they can make an appeal directly to EOHLC, and then EOHLC will hold a similar hearing process and make a similar decision. And then at that point, the appeals process could be extended into the court system, but we don't really cover that particular piece of it. It kind of ends for our purposes with our appeal at EOHLC. So it's a long process. It's meant to be fair. It's meant to accommodate folks who obviously are claiming to be homeless. So it's important that the process is rigorous, but it all starts with that action by the applicant to request the process. So that's very important. So I think, Melanie, we can go to the next slide. All right. So I wanted to talk to us a little bit about CHAMP and kind of what's been going on with CHAMP. And then we maybe have time for a little bit of a quick walkthrough of some of the items that are coming up or some of the most recently integrated items. So one thing that we always want to focus on is kind of how we're updating CHAMP for more transparency and providing more information to applicants. So this is one of the primary ways we're doing that is by providing applicants with more information about where they are in the process and kind of what step they're in the process. So as we'll see in a little bit, when you log into your dashboard as an applicant, you have this kind of train stop navigation sidebar that shows you various pages, including which step you're on, gives you a button to take you to the next step. It shows you a while you wait page with more information about what to do while you wait for the next step, summary pages, and we also have kind of an enhanced screening, enhanced letter inbox that we'll walk through. We recently instituted digital notifications for applicants, so this includes emails and text messages for folks who have that enabled. There's also the new application summary, which shows us kind of where, what pieces of where we are, kind of with more information about where we are in the actual process. And then importantly, there's the new step-by-step TurboTax style document submission process. This looks like my old slide, so I'll make sure the slide gets updated in the presentation that's sent to you folks. But additionally to these upcoming enhancements, I did want to touch upon the fact that CHAMP will be being updated to reflect the changes to the recent priority regulations. So recently, regulations were promulgated that had some pretty substantial impacts to how applicants can apply using CHAMP. Melanie had mentioned one of those substantial impacts earlier when she had referenced the restriction to 2 priorities. Additionally, one of the larger changes related to this is going to be the implementation of a restriction to 25 housing authorities that folks can apply to at any given time. So right now it's pretty open, and we have a lot of folks who end up applying to hundreds of places, and then end up not being able to respond for one reason or another. And so in order to address that, we've kind of provided both additional geographical information about where certain places are located, and there's a new restriction in the regulations in terms of um, how many places an applicant can apply to. And so that will be coming out. You'll see those changes in January. So the goals of this, all these changes obviously are transparency into the process and primarily more information for applicants. So if you just bear with me while I get my, and of course they'll log me out. So just bear with me while I get logged back in here. Okay. So Melanie, I am going to attempt to steal the share from you,
Okay.
if that's okay.
Yep.
If I can find out how to do that. There we go. I'm going to replace the current share. That's what it's asking me to do. So I'm going to do that.
Should I stop share? Should I just select stop share?
No, I think it's going to allow me to do this.
You should be able to usurp. I think that you have the
Yeah,
power.
I'm going to go with entire screen here. There we go. Oh, look at these guys. Pull this up. And of course, the share bar is in the way there. We're a teams organization,
I
so
know.
this
I
Zoom
always
stuff is
apologize to our state official friends because you really have to.
yeah, we're a team shop, so apologies on the Zoom issues. But no, so this is the this is what Champ looks like. This is Champ. If I were to log out, you'd basically be redirected to the Champ home screen. Um, this is the dashboard. This is what applicants see when they first log in terms of their application, their wait lists, their screening summary, and their personal settings page. Now, primarily what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about this train map here. I'm also going to show folks the new maps, the new mapping technology that we have available for applicants looking to apply to various places. And we'll cover those. And then in the presentation that you receive, I'll make sure to include some of the screenshots that we don't get to. So the first thing that we want to show you is this is the train stop navigation sidebar. So as you can see as an applicant, this person has already submitted their application, but as you can see as an applicant, when you're completing your application, you're in step 1. When you're selecting where you want to live, you're in step 2. And once you submit, now you'll be waiting for priority screening, which is step 3. If you were an applicant who didn't actually select a priority, you wouldn't have this step 3. This is just for folks who do select it, and it's dynamically, related to kind of what you're claiming in your application form. As you kind of progress through the system, once you're screened for priority, you'll eventually be in step 4, which typically will be the step that takes folks the longest, right? You're waiting for an offer from a housing authority. You're waiting to be screened from a housing authority. And once you eventually are screened, then you get into step 5. And ultimately, the goal is to get to step 6. Since we're here in step 3, I kind of want to show you what that page looks like. when we click into it. So this is the while you wait page, right? And this is you're waiting to be screened by ASG. So on this page, we're hoping to give applicants more information related to um, why are they waiting? What are they waiting for? What is this process, right? What is screening all about? What's going to happen with screening? And you'll see here and if you ever helped applicants, you've probably seen this yourself. But you'll see here that we give a lot of the information that basically Melanie and I just covered, more abbreviated, of course. But we also link to many of the same pages, including, see if this will open up, the priority checklist, right? The housing checklist, in order to kind of walk applicants through a little bit of what we all just went through together. Additionally, we provide them with some context about what eligibility screening is and how it's more related to their demographics and their program eligibility and qualifications as opposed to their priority. But we provided this page as a kind of a while you wait page because we've realized over the course of this process is that this stuff's complicated. And folks need as many reminders and as many kind of informational tips as possible to kind of keep themselves focused on kind of what that next step is, right? And so by providing this navigation style traffic, train stop map, we're hoping to provide a little bit more context to where in the world a person might be with their application. So we're going to just jump into the application a little bit because I wanted to show you folks the new step-by-step application process. So last year, we really started focusing on applicants and their workflows. We did it a little bit reverse, but the first thing we did was a step-by-step TurboTax style workflow for eligibility and for priority screening documentation. So that workflow, it looks very similar to this, right? You have again, we love our train stop maps here, our navigation maps on the side here. You have a very similar, train stop map that will take you through each of the pieces of documentation that you need to submit. Now, this one is for the application progress, but it's only because we based this one off of the documentation workflow. So same as the documentation, it will take you through each specific step or each specific section of the application. And each time you enter something or move to the next page, it will ask you to certify the information before going forward. And applicants can come in here and edit something once they've already been submitted or enter information anew if they haven't submitted it at all. And basically, the whole idea is you go through each of these sections, and through doing this, each of the sections help you can answer the questions and make it a little bit more digestible and perhaps meaningful, given that isn't just one, 45-page application you're scrolling through hoping you filled out the right way, right? So this is all in an effort to guide applicants in the process of actually just completing the information they need to complete. So the reason why I wanted to show us this primarily is related to the housing finder. So this is a new addition to Champ. In previous iterations of Champ, when you went to go select a given place that you wanted to live, you basically just got a list of places, a list of town names and programs together, and basically you had to go and apply. So of course we had a lot of people just going through and selecting every place because if you're homeless and in a precarious kind of housing situation, it makes sense to kind of cast your net as wide as possible. But we realized that was creating a lot of inefficiencies, and many folks didn't actually really want to live in the places that they were applying. And so we've instituted both the 25 housing authority cap, which caps the number of places that applicants can live in. And we've also simultaneously added this new housing finder feature, which gives folks a much better geographic picture of the places that they can apply to. So as you can see here, I'm scrolling through Massachusetts, and this is highlighting in blue all the towns that I can apply to. So this is showing me places that are available to me based upon my selections of which programs that I want to apply to, um, showing me the towns that I can visually see on the map, right? Critically, we also highlight where a person lives. So this star over here represents where I live. So when I'm making this decision now, I'm probably, given that I live in Amherst, I'm probably not going to be looking for,
Yeah. And then
wait lists in Linfield or
so
Reading,
yeah,
right? Or
that's
maybe on the
right.
Cape. So it's just to provide additional geographic information for applicants making decisions. And we feel like that's actually pretty critical given the 25 selection, the 25 housing authority cap. Um, and when you select a view in the map, it also will filter the available wait list for you. And then also if you select just a town, you'll see it filtered directly to that wait list in particular. So these are all new features that have been released in the last, I want to say 3 months. So they're brand new. So we're really excited about folks to use them and to provide us feedback on them and how they're actually working. One thing I want to show, and this applicant really is probably not a great example for this, but basically, when an applicant is pulled into screening, they'll have a My Screening summary, which will show them um, the status of their information or the status of their claims. So here you can see that my test applicant that I've created, has applied for homeless priority natural forces and a local preference in Amherst. And you can see that everything's kind of gray and bland here because nothing's going on. The indicator here is that we're not in screening yet, which means that ASG hasn't pulled a batch that my applicant has been pulled into yet. So we're not in screening yet, which is why we kind of give you the learn more here. As soon as my applicant is pulled into screening, I would get an updated status, and I would get a status update the entire time, ASG is working on my application all the way through whatever decision it is that they end up making. This page is important because um, it kind of correlates with that updated inbox that we have for applicants. So here is a place where they can access their applicant file, and they can review all of the letters that have been sent to them. They can view all of the documents that have been uploaded into their applicant file. And they can also view and upload additional screening documentation that isn't related to the workflow that I was mentioning earlier. So I think this is probably a good place to start or to pause here for the demo, given the items that we've gone over. I do think I'm gonna make sure my slides get a little bit more updated with a few screenshots of the things we didn't get to. So apologies on the mishap with the PowerPoint. But I think yeah, I think thank you very much for having us and for allowing us to kind of walk you through a little bit of the CHAMP process.
Thank you both so much. This was really, really helpful. And we have lots of questions. So I'm going to stop recording